This is 97.4 FM broadcasting from downtown Portland, Oregon. I'm Levi Brooks, and if you're hearing my voice right now, then you're one of the lucky ones. The time is 11:47 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, November 15th. Outside this studio, the temperature has dropped to 23 degrees, which is unusual for Portland this time of year. But then again, nothing about tonight is usual. The air smells wrong, like burnt metal and something chemical that makes your throat burn when you breathe too deep. I can see fires burning across the Willamette River, orange dots scattered through what used to be the residential districts on the east side. The streetlights went out about 3 hours ago, but the fires give off enough light that I can make out shapes moving in the streets below. People, I think, though it's hard to tell from 7 stories up. If this signal's reaching you, drop the first word you hear me say. Prove you're tuned in. I've been a radio host for 12 years, broadcasting the overnight shift here at 97.4 FM, playing music for insomniacs and night shift workers, taking calls about relationship problems and lost pets. Tonight, I'm not playing music. Tonight, I'm trying to figure out what happened to our world, and I'm hoping that by talking through it, by sharing what I know and what I've seen, maybe we can start to make sense of this nightmare. Maybe we can help each other survive whatever comes next. The backup generator is keeping us on the air, but I don't know for how long. The building's main power cut out at 8:15 p.m., along with everything else in the downtown core. My phone died around the same time, not from a dead battery, but something else. The screen just went black and never came back on. Same thing happened to my car when I tried to leave the building earlier. Turn the key. Nothing. Not even the radio or the dashboard lights. It's like everything electronic just stopped working all at once. But let me back up and tell you how this started, because I think understanding the beginning might help us figure out what we're dealing with. It was around 6:30 p.m. when the first emergency alert came through on the emergency broadcast system. Standard nuclear attack warning, the kind we used to do drills for in school, but never thought we'd actually hear. The computerized voice was calm, almost casual, telling people in the Pacific Northwest to seek immediate shelter, avoid looking directly at bright flashes, stay away from windows. At first, I thought it might be a test. Maybe someone hit the wrong button at NORAD or wherever they send these things from. Then the phone started ringing. The first call was from Maria Santos, our evening news director. She was at home in Beaverton when the alert came through, and she called to ask if I knew anything about it. Her voice was tight with worry, but not panic yet. She said she'd tried calling the newsroom and the station manager, but nobody was answering. She'd also tried reaching her contacts at the police department and City Hall, but all the phone lines seemed to be jammed or down. That's when I started to get nervous, because Maria has been in news for 20 years, and she's the kind of person who always has a source, always has someone she can call to verify a story. If she couldn't reach anybody, that meant something was seriously wrong. About 10 minutes later, the emergency broadcast system activated again, but this time the message was different. Instead of the usual computerized voice, there was a human operator, and I could hear tension in his voice, even through the static. He said there were confirmed missile launches detected over the Pacific, targeting major population centers on the West Coast. He said people should take shelter immediately in basements or interior rooms, away from windows, and prepare for multiple impacts over the next several hours. Then the broadcast cut out mid-sentence, and we never heard another official emergency message after that. That's when I saw the first flash. I was standing by the studio windows, looking out at the city, trying to see if there were any signs of panic or preparation in the streets below. The flash came from the west, from the direction of the coast, brighter than anything I've ever seen. For just a second, it was like someone had turned on a giant spotlight that covered the entire sky. I instinctively closed my eyes and turned away, remembering the warnings about not looking directly at nuclear detonations. But even with my eyes closed and facing away from the window, I could see the light through my eyelids. It was followed by a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the building's structure and up through the floor into my bones. The second flash came about 15 minutes later, this time from the north, and I realized they were hitting multiple targets, Seattle maybe, or the naval base at Bremerton. The third flash was closer, probably somewhere around Salem, or maybe even Portland International Airport. Each flash was followed by that same deep rumbling, but the third one was loud enough to crack the studio windows and set off car alarms in the parking garage across the street. That's when the power went out, not just in our building, but everywhere I could see. The entire downtown core went dark in an instant, like someone had thrown a switch and turned off the city. I tried the emergency radio equipment we keep for situations like this, but most of the normal emergency frequencies were silent. No police dispatch, no fire department, no emergency management. Just static and occasional bursts of what sounded like military communications, too garbled and fast to understand. I did pick up some civilian radio chatter on the amateur bands, people with shortwave radios trying to figure out what was happening, sharing rumors and asking if anyone had information about their neighborhoods or family members. Most of it was panicked and contradictory, but I started to piece together a picture of what had happened. From what I could gather from the radio chatter, the attacks had been coordinated and widespread. Multiple cities along the West Coast had been hit, not just the major population centers, but also military installations, ports, and infrastructure targets. Someone mentioned seeing missiles coming down near the port of Portland, and another voice said the bridges over the Columbia River were gone. A ham radio operator in Salem reported massive fires and what looked like a mushroom cloud rising from the direction of the state capitol. All of this information was secondhand and impossible to verify, but the consistency of the report suggested that whatever had happened was bigger than just a single attack or accident. The strangest part was what happened to all the electronics. It wasn't just the power grid that failed. It was everything. Cars, phones, radios, anything with electronic components just stopped working. I remembered reading about electromagnetic pulse effects from nuclear weapons, how the radiation could fry electronic circuits over a wide area. But I'd never really understood what that would mean in practical terms. Now I was seeing it firsthand, and it was more devastating than I'd ever imagined. We've become so dependent on electronic systems that when they all fail at once, civilization basically stops functioning. Around 9 p.m., I started hearing voices in the stairwell. The building's security system had failed along with everything else, so people were getting in somehow. I could hear footsteps and muffled conversations echoing up from the lower floors. Some of them sounded scared, others angry, and I realized that people were probably looking for shelter, information, or supplies. The radio station was one of the few buildings downtown with a backup generator, so we still had some power and heat while everywhere else was dark and cold. I thought about going down to see if I could help anyone, but something about the tone of the voices made me hesitate. There was an edge to them that suggested desperation was already setting in. About an hour later, I heard pounding on the studio door, heavy, insistent knocking that went on for several minutes before stopping. I didn't answer, partly because I wasn't sure who it was, and partly because I felt like maintaining some kind of communication with the outside world was more important than letting strangers into the studio. In hindsight, I'm not sure if that was the right choice, but at the time, it seemed like the responsible thing to do. The knocking stopped eventually, and I heard footsteps moving away down the hallway. That's when I decided to start broadcasting. The station's emergency protocols called for continuing operations as long as possible in case of disaster, and I figured that people who still had working radios, maybe older models or ham equipment that wasn't affected by the electromagnetic pulse, might need information and reassurance. I also thought that if there were any other radio stations still operating, maybe we could coordinate and share information. So I powered up the transmitter and started talking, not really sure if anyone was listening, but hoping that my voice might reach someone who needed to hear it. The first person who responded was actually another radio operator, someone with a ham setup in the hills west of the city. He confirmed that he'd also seen the flashes and heard the explosions, and that he'd been monitoring emergency frequencies without success. He told me his name was Robert, and that he'd been a radio enthusiast for 30 years, ever since he served in the military. He had some technical knowledge about radio propagation and electromagnetic effects, and he helped me understand why most of the electronic systems had failed while our backup equipment was still working. Apparently, some older vacuum tube equipment and systems with basic shielding can survive electromagnetic pulses that would destroy modern semiconductors and integrated circuits. Robert also shared some disturbing information about what he'd observed from his location on the hills overlooking the city. He said he could see fires burning throughout the metro area, not just from the direct impact sites, but also from secondary fires caused by the electrical failures and infrastructure collapse. Gas stations, chemical plants, anywhere that stored flammable materials was potentially dangerous now that automated safety systems were offline. He'd also seen what looked like mass movement of people on the major highways, though it was hard to tell if they were evacuating or just trying to get home to their families. More troubling was his report about the weather. The temperature had been dropping steadily since the attacks, and there was an unusual haze in the air that wasn't just smoke from the fires. Robert speculated that debris thrown into the atmosphere by the nuclear detonations was already beginning to affect local weather patterns, potentially blocking sunlight and causing rapid cooling. He'd read about nuclear winter scenarios, and while he wasn't a scientist, he was worried that we might be seeing the early stages of that kind of climatic disruption. As the night wore on, I began to receive intermittent contact from other survivors scattered around the region. Most of them had battery-powered or hand-crank radios, the kind that people keep for camping or emergency preparedness. Their reports painted a picture of widespread destruction and growing chaos. The transportation system had completely collapsed, not just because of the electromagnetic pulse effects, but also because of physical damage to roads and bridges from the attacks. Anyone who had been driving when the pulse hit was stranded wherever their car had stopped, and with no working cell phones or internet, there was no way to coordinate rescue or evacuation efforts. The emergency services were effectively non-existent. Police and fire departments relied heavily on electronic communication and navigation systems, all of which had been destroyed. Even if individual officers or firefighters wanted to help, they had no way to coordinate their efforts or respond to calls for help. Hospitals were running on backup power where they had it, but their modern medical equipment was largely inoperable. People with conditions requiring electronic monitoring or life support were in immediate danger. But perhaps most disturbing was what I wasn't hearing. There were no government emergency broadcasts, no coordination from federal or state authorities, no indication that anyone in charge had a plan for dealing with this situation. Either the government had been decapitated by the attacks, or they were holed up in bunkers somewhere without the ability to communicate with the civilian population. In either case, it meant that we were essentially on our own, at least for the immediate future. As I continued broadcasting throughout the night, sharing information and trying to provide some sense of connection for isolated survivors, I began to realize the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't just a military attack that we could recover from once the immediate danger passed. The electromagnetic pulse effects had essentially destroyed the technological infrastructure that modern civilization depends on. Even if there were no more attacks, even if the radiation dangers diminished over time, we were looking at a complete societal collapse. No power grid, no communications, no transportation, no supply chains, no government coordination. We'd been thrown back to a pre-industrial level of technology overnight, but without the knowledge, skills, or social structures that people in earlier times had developed to survive without modern conveniences. The sun is going to rise in about 6 hours, and I suspect that daylight is going to reveal the true extent of the devastation. But for now, I'm going to keep broadcasting, sharing what information I have, and hoping that somewhere out there, someone is listening and taking comfort in the fact that they're not completely alone in this new world we've found ourselves in. If you're hearing my voice, please know that you're not forgotten. We're going to figure out how to survive this together, one day at a time. This is Levi Brooks continuing on 97.4 FM. It's now 12:43 a.m., November 16th, and I've just received some disturbing information that I need to share with anyone who might be listening. About 20 minutes ago, I made contact with a woman named Sarah Chen, who lives in the Hawthorne district, about 3 miles southeast of downtown. She has a hand-crank emergency radio, and she's been listening to my broadcast since around 11 p.m. What she told me has changed my understanding of what we're dealing with here. Sarah is a nurse at OHSU, or rather, she was until tonight. She was working the evening shift when the electromagnetic pulse hit, and she witnessed firsthand what happened to the hospital's systems. According to her, it wasn't just the computers and electronic equipment that failed. The backup generators, which should have been hardened against this kind of interference, also went down. The emergency lighting systems failed. Even simple electronic devices like digital thermometers and blood pressure monitors stopped working. She said it was like watching the entire modern medical system just shut down in an instant. But that's not the most disturbing part. Sarah told me that she and several other staff members tried to help patients who were dependent on electronic life support systems. Ventilators, cardiac monitors, dialysis machines, all of it dead. They tried to manually ventilate patients and provide basic care, but without any of the monitoring equipment they depend on, it was almost impossible to keep track of multiple critical patients. She estimates that they lost at least 15 people in the first hour after the pulse, not from radiation or blast effects, but simply from the collapse of the technological systems that were keeping them alive. What really shook me was when she described trying to leave the hospital around 10 p.m. She said the streets in her neighborhood looked like a war zone, not from nuclear destruction, but from the complete breakdown of social order. Traffic lights were out. Cars were abandoned in the middle of intersections where they'd stopped when their engines died. People were wandering around in a daze, some carrying suitcases or bags, others just walking aimlessly, like they couldn't process what had happened. She saw several accidents where people had been injured when their cars suddenly stopped on busy roads, and there was no way to call for ambulances or emergency services. More troubling was her description of human behavior in the immediate aftermath. She said she witnessed multiple incidents of looting and violence, even in the first few hours after the attacks. Stores with manual locks or older security systems were being broken into, and people were fighting over supplies, food, and anything that might be useful for survival. She described seeing a group of people trying to break into a pharmacy, presumably looking for medications, while another group was ransacking a grocery store. The veneer of civilization, she said, seemed to disappear almost instantly once people realized that there were no police, no authority figures, no consequences for their actions. Sarah also shared some technical information that explains why our radio equipment is still working when so much other technology failed. She said her brother is an electrical engineer, and he's explained to her in the past how electromagnetic pulses work. Apparently, the pulse creates a massive surge of electrical current in any conductor, basically overloading and destroying electronic circuits. But older, simpler electronics, especially those with vacuum tubes instead of semiconductors, are much more resistant to this kind of damage. Our radio station's backup equipment was installed in the 1970s, before everything became computerized, which is probably why we're still able to broadcast. This information helped me understand something I'd been puzzling over. I'd been wondering why some people had working radios while others didn't. It's not random. It's based on the age and design of the equipment. Newer digital radios, anything with computer chips or integrated circuits, would have been destroyed by the pulse. But older analog radios, especially simple AM/FM receivers, might still function. This means that the people who can hear my broadcast are probably those who happen to have older equipment, emergency preparedness gear, or devices that were somehow shielded from the electromagnetic effects. Around 1 a.m., I received another contact that provided more pieces of the puzzle. This time it was from someone calling himself Mike, broadcasting from somewhere in the industrial district along the Columbia River. Mike works, or worked, at one of the shipping terminals, and he was on duty when the attacks occurred. His account of what he witnessed provides some crucial information about the scope and nature of the strikes. According to Mike, the first explosion he saw was over the river, somewhere in the direction of the Bonneville Dam. He said the flash was visible even in daylight, followed by a mushroom cloud that rose several miles into the air. About 30 minutes later, he saw another explosion to the north, which he believes was somewhere around the Portland International Airport, or possibly the military facilities at the Vancouver Barracks across the river in Washington. The third explosion, which he said was the closest and most intense, appeared to be directly over downtown Portland, probably somewhere near the federal buildings or the port facilities. Mike's description of the immediate aftermath was particularly chilling. He said that within minutes of the final explosion, he could see fires starting throughout the city, not just from the direct effects of the blast, but from all the secondary failures caused by the electromagnetic pulse. Gas stations where the automatic shutoff systems had failed, chemical storage facilities where safety systems were offline, residential areas where electrical failures had sparked fires and damaged wiring. He estimated that he could see at least 50 separate fires burning across the metro area within an hour of the attacks. But Mike also provided some potentially useful information about infrastructure that might still be functional. He said that the shipping terminal where he works has some older mechanical equipment that wasn't affected by the pulse. Diesel generators without electronic ignition systems, manual cranes, and other industrial equipment that relies on mechanical rather than electronic controls. He's been working with a small group of other employees to try to secure the facility and inventory whatever supplies might be useful for survival. They have access to large quantities of non-perishable food, medical supplies, and fuel, all stored in warehouses that are relatively secure and defensible. This gave me an idea that I want to share with any listeners who might be in a position to act on it. If Mike is right about older mechanical systems still being functional, then there might be other pockets of working infrastructure scattered around the city. Older buildings with manual systems, industrial facilities with mechanical equipment, maybe even some vehicles with older, simpler engines that weren't destroyed by the pulse. The key would be finding these resources and securing them before they're looted or destroyed by desperate people. Mike also shared some disturbing observations about radiation levels. He said that he has a mechanical Geiger counter, the kind that doesn't require batteries or electronic circuits, and it's been showing elevated readings since the attacks. Not immediately dangerous levels, but significantly higher than normal background radiation. He's concerned that the fallout from the nuclear detonations is beginning to settle over the area, carried by wind patterns from the blast sites. This means that in addition to the immediate destruction and technological collapse, we're also facing the long-term health effects of radiation exposure. The radiation threat adds another layer of complexity to our survival situation. Even if we can find food, water, and shelter, we also need to protect ourselves from invisible contamination that could cause illness or death over the coming weeks and months. Mike mentioned that his facility has some basic radiation protection equipment, lead-lined storage areas, and protective clothing used for handling industrial materials. But most civilians would have no access to this kind of protection. At 1:30 a.m., I received what might be the most important communication of the night. A man identifying himself as Dr. James Morrison contacted me from what he said was a secure facility somewhere in the West Hills. Dr. Morrison claimed to be a former military officer with experience in nuclear warfare planning, and he had information about what we might expect in the coming days and weeks. According to Dr. Morrison, the pattern of attacks we experienced suggests a coordinated strike designed to maximize long-term damage to the Pacific Northwest's infrastructure and population. The targets weren't chosen randomly. They were selected to create cascading failures that would prevent recovery efforts. Taking out the Bonneville Dam would disrupt power generation and river transportation. Hitting the airport would prevent air evacuation or resupply. Attacking the port facilities would cut off maritime supply lines. The downtown strike would decapitate local government and emergency services. Dr. Morrison explained that this kind of systematic targeting indicates a sophisticated adversary with detailed knowledge of our infrastructure vulnerabilities. This wasn't a desperate last strike or a terrorist attack with limited resources. This was a carefully planned operation designed to inflict maximum long-term damage with relatively few weapons. He speculated that similar coordinated attacks had probably been carried out against other major metropolitan areas along the West Coast, and possibly throughout the entire country. But Dr. Morrison's most chilling prediction concerned what he called the second wave of casualties. The immediate deaths from the nuclear detonations and electromagnetic pulse effects would be followed by a much larger die-off caused by the collapse of modern support systems. People dependent on medication, medical devices, or specialized care would begin dying within days. The disruption of food and water distribution would cause starvation and dehydration within weeks. The breakdown of sanitation systems would lead to disease outbreaks within months. He estimated that in a major metropolitan area like Portland, the long-term casualty rate could exceed 70% of the population. This projection was sobering, but Dr. Morrison also provided some hope. He said that communities with good organization, access to resources, and knowledge of basic survival skills could significantly improve their chances. The key factors for survival would be securing clean water sources, establishing reliable food production or storage, creating defensible shelter, organizing effective leadership and cooperation, and developing basic medical care capabilities without modern technology. Dr. Morrison offered to share more specific survival information in future broadcasts, including details about radiation protection, water purification, food preservation, and basic medical care using materials that might still be available. He also said that he was in contact with other survivors who had military or emergency preparedness backgrounds, and they were working to establish a network of mutual aid and information sharing. As I sit here in this studio, looking out at the fires burning across what used to be my city, I'm trying to process everything I've learned tonight. The scope of the disaster is almost beyond comprehension. We're not just dealing with the immediate effects of nuclear attacks. We're facing the complete collapse of the technological civilization that we've become dependent on for survival. The electronic systems that control our power, communications, transportation, medical care, food distribution, and every other aspect of modern life have been destroyed, and there's no quick way to replace them. The human cost is already staggering and will only get worse. People are dying right now, not just from radiation or blast effects, but from the sudden loss of the systems that were keeping them alive. More will die in the coming days from injuries, illness, and violence as social order continues to break down. The long-term outlook, according to Dr. Morrison's analysis, is even more grim. But I also heard something else in tonight's communications that gives me a different kind of hope. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, despite the fear and uncertainty, people are already beginning to adapt. Sarah the nurse is organizing medical care without modern equipment. Mike is securing resources and working with others to create a defendable community. Dr. Morrison is sharing knowledge and building networks of mutual aid. Even in the depths of this catastrophe, human beings are doing what we've always done, working together, sharing resources, and fighting for survival. The sun will rise in about 4 hours, and daylight will reveal the true extent of what we're facing. But it will also give us our first real opportunity to begin the work of survival and recovery. If you're listening to this broadcast, you've already taken the first step by staying informed and maintaining contact with other survivors. In the coming days, we're going to need to work together, share information and resources, and support each other through what may be the greatest challenge our civilization has ever faced. This is Levi Brooks on 97.4 FM. I'll continue broadcasting as long as the generator holds out, and as long as there are people who need to hear these words. You are not alone. We will get through this together. This is Levi Brooks on 97.4 FM. The time is now 2:15 a.m., November 16th, and I need to share some critical information I've just received. In the past 30 minutes, I've been in contact with multiple survivors across the region, and a disturbing pattern is emerging that suggests our situation is even more dire than I initially understood. The first call came from Janet Walsh in Lake Oswego, about 8 miles south of downtown. Janet is a retired emergency management coordinator who worked for Clackamas County for 15 years before her retirement last year. She has extensive experience in disaster planning and response, and her assessment of our current situation is deeply troubling. According to Janet, the electromagnetic pulse effects we experienced are consistent with what's called a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse attack, where nuclear weapons are detonated in the upper atmosphere, specifically to maximize the electronic disruption over the widest possible area. Janet explained that this type of attack is particularly devastating because it can affect electronic systems across hundreds of thousands of square miles with just a few well-placed detonations. The weapons don't need to hit ground targets to be effective. They just need to reach the right altitude to generate maximum electromagnetic interference. This means that the destruction we're seeing in Portland is likely replicated across the entire Pacific Northwest and possibly much of the western United States. We're not dealing with an isolated regional disaster. This could be a continent-wide catastrophe. More concerning is Janet's analysis of the recovery timeline. She said that even under the best circumstances, restoring power grid functionality after this kind of electromagnetic damage would take months or years, not days or weeks. The power plants themselves might be repairable, but the distribution systems, the transformers, the control systems, all of that electronic infrastructure would need to be completely rebuilt. And that assumes we have access to replacement components, manufacturing facilities, and the organized workforce necessary for such a massive undertaking. Given the scope of the destruction, none of those assumptions are realistic. Janet also provided some sobering statistics about what this means for civilian survival. She said that studies conducted by the Department of Homeland Security estimated that a nationwide electromagnetic pulse attack could result in the deaths of up to 90% of the American population within the first year, not from the immediate effects of the attack, but from the cascading failures of the systems that modern society depends on for survival. Food distribution, medical care, water treatment, sanitation, heating and cooling, all of it relies on electronic control systems that no longer exist. The second call that changed my understanding came from Marcus Rivera, who contacted me from somewhere in the industrial area near Swan Island. Marcus is a mechanical engineer who specializes in power generation systems, and he's been working since the attacks to assess the damage to local infrastructure. His findings are both devastating and revealing about the sophistication of whoever planned this attack. According to Marcus, the attackers didn't just rely on electromagnetic pulse effects to destroy our infrastructure. They also targeted specific physical installations that would be critical for recovery efforts. The Bonneville Dam, which provides hydroelectric power for much of the region, wasn't just hit by the electromagnetic pulse. It was physically destroyed by what appears to have been a ground-burst nuclear weapon. The explosion didn't just knock out the dam's electronic systems, it damaged the concrete structure itself, potentially causing massive flooding downstream and eliminating one of our primary sources of electrical power permanently. Similarly, Marcus said that the explosion over Portland International Airport wasn't positioned to maximize electromagnetic effects over the city. It was placed to physically destroy the airport's runways, terminals, and aircraft. This suggests that the attackers wanted to prevent any possibility of air evacuation, resupply, or coordination with outside regions. They weren't just trying to cause temporary disruption. They were systematically eliminating our ability to recover or receive outside assistance. Marcus has been able to reach other engineers and technical personnel through ham radio networks, and their collective assessment is that the attack was planned with an intimate knowledge of regional infrastructure vulnerabilities. The targets were chosen not just for immediate impact, but for maximum long-term disruption of recovery efforts. This level of planning and coordination suggests either a major nation-state adversary with extensive intelligence capabilities, or possibly even inside knowledge from people familiar with our infrastructure systems. At 2:45 a.m., I received what may be the most disturbing communication yet. Dr. Lisa Park contacted me from what she described as an underground facility somewhere in the Tualatin Hills. Dr. Park is a physician who specializes in radiation medicine, and she's been monitoring radiation levels across the metro area using detection equipment that survived the electromagnetic pulse. Her measurements indicate that we're facing a much more serious contamination problem than anyone initially realized. According to Dr. Park, the nuclear weapons used in the attack were specifically designed to maximize radioactive fallout. Instead of clean fusion weapons that would minimize long-term contamination, the attackers used what she called salted bombs, weapons enhanced with materials that create long-lasting radioactive isotopes. The fallout from these weapons doesn't just pose a health risk for weeks or months. It could make large areas uninhabitable for years or even decades. Dr. Park's radiation monitoring shows dangerous contamination levels throughout the metropolitan area, with particularly high readings in areas downwind of the blast sites. The Columbia River corridor, which many people might consider a natural evacuation route, is showing some of the highest contamination levels due to radioactive materials settling in the water and being carried downstream. Even areas that weren't directly hit by nuclear weapons are receiving dangerous levels of fallout carried by wind patterns from the blast sites. The medical implications are staggering. Dr. Park explained that people who remain in the contaminated areas for extended periods will begin showing symptoms of acute radiation sickness within days. Those symptoms include nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, and eventual organ failure. Even people who survive the initial radiation exposure will face dramatically increased risks of cancer and other long-term health problems. Children and pregnant women are particularly vulnerable, and their survival rates in heavily contaminated areas could be extremely low. But perhaps most troubling is Dr. Park's assessment of our medical response capabilities. The hospitals that might normally treat radiation exposure victims have been crippled by the same electromagnetic pulse that destroyed everything else. Even basic medical equipment like IV pumps, heart monitors, and diagnostic devices are non-functional. The specialized drugs used to treat radiation sickness require refrigeration and have short shelf lives. And without power for refrigeration or supply chains to deliver new medications, these treatments are essentially unavailable. Dr. Park is coordinating with other medical professionals to establish basic treatment centers using manual equipment and whatever supplies they can salvage, but she's realistic about their limitations. They can provide supportive care, pain management, and basic first aid, but they can't perform the kind of intensive medical interventions that radiation exposure victims typically require. She estimates that the survival rate for people with severe radiation exposure will be less than 10% without access to modern medical facilities. Around 3:30 a.m., I was contacted by someone who identified himself only as Colonel Anderson. He claimed to be broadcasting from a military facility that survived the initial attacks, and he had information about the broader strategic situation that puts our local disaster into a much larger and more frightening context. According to Colonel Anderson, the attacks on the Pacific Northwest were part of a coordinated nuclear strike against the entire United States. Major metropolitan areas, military installations, and critical infrastructure targets across the country were hit simultaneously in what appears to have been a carefully planned first strike designed to decapitate American military and governmental capability. He said that initial reports suggest that Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and dozens of other major cities have been destroyed or severely damaged. The scope of the attack explains why we haven't heard any coordinated government response or emergency broadcasts from federal authorities. According to Colonel Anderson, the normal chain of command and communication systems have been completely disrupted. Even military installations that survived the initial strikes are having difficulty coordinating with each other due to the electromagnetic pulse effects on communication systems. Colonel Anderson also provided some intelligence about who might be responsible for the attacks. He said that the coordination, timing, and sophistication of the strike suggests a major adversary with substantial nuclear capabilities and detailed intelligence about American infrastructure vulnerabilities. The use of electromagnetic pulse weapons combined with physical targeting of critical facilities indicates months or years of planning and preparation. Most disturbing was Colonel Anderson's assessment of the international situation. He said that early intelligence reports suggest that similar attacks may have been carried out against other NATO allies, particularly those with significant military capabilities or strategic importance. This wasn't just an attack on the United States. It appears to be part of a broader campaign to eliminate Western military and economic power. Colonel Anderson warned that the immediate nuclear strikes might be just the beginning of our problems. With American military capabilities severely degraded, our adversaries might follow up with conventional military action, cyber attacks against any remaining electronic systems, or even biological or chemical weapons designed to further reduce the population and eliminate resistance capabilities. But Colonel Anderson also provided some hope. He said that despite the devastating nature of the initial attacks, significant military assets and personnel survived, particularly in hardened facilities designed to withstand nuclear strikes. These surviving units are working to establish communication networks, coordinate response efforts, and maintain some level of organized resistance capability. He couldn't provide specific details about locations or capabilities, but he assured listeners that the United States military hadn't been completely eliminated. As dawn approaches, I'm beginning to understand that what we're facing goes far beyond a regional disaster or even a national catastrophe. We appear to be experiencing the opening phase of what could be World War III, fought with weapons and tactics designed to completely destroy modern technological civilization. The scope and sophistication of the attacks suggest that our adversaries have been planning this campaign for years, carefully studying our vulnerabilities and developing strategies to exploit them with maximum effect. The immediate challenges facing survivors in the Portland metro area are staggering. We're dealing with widespread radiation contamination, complete infrastructure collapse, breakdown of social order, and the beginning of what could be massive population die-offs from starvation, disease, and exposure. The long-term challenges may be even worse, as we're forced to rebuild some form of civilization from the ruins of our technological society, while potentially facing ongoing attacks from enemies who retain significant military capabilities. But as I've been broadcasting through this long night, I've also heard something that gives me hope. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, despite the fear and uncertainty, people are already beginning to adapt and organize. Medical professionals are establishing treatment centers with manual equipment. Engineers are identifying surviving infrastructure and resources. Military personnel are maintaining communication networks and coordination capabilities. Ordinary citizens are sharing information, pooling resources, and working together for mutual survival. The sun will rise in less than 2 hours, and daylight will give us our first real opportunity to assess the full extent of the damage and begin the work of organized survival. The challenges we face are unprecedented in modern history, but human beings have survived similar catastrophes before, and we will survive this one. The key will be working together, sharing knowledge and resources, maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming adversity, and never forgetting that we are still human beings with the capacity for courage, compassion, and resilience. This is Levi Brooks on 97.4 FM, and I will continue broadcasting as long as possible to provide information, coordination, and connection for anyone who needs to hear these words. We are not alone, we are not defeated, and we will find a way to survive and rebuild. The night has been long and terrible, but dawn is coming, and with it, the beginning of whatever comes next. This is Levi Brooks continuing on 97.4 FM. It's now 4:22 a.m. November 16th, and I can see the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. What that pale light is revealing across the city is worse than anything I could have imagined during the dark hours of the night. From my position here on the 7th floor, I can see across most of downtown Portland and into the residential areas beyond, and the landscape looks like something from the end of the world. The fires that I could see burning last night have spread throughout the night, creating a patchwork of destruction that extends in every direction. Entire city blocks are reduced to smoking rubble, and I can count at least 30 separate major fires still burning out of control. Without functioning fire departments, water pressure, or any coordinated firefighting capability, these blazes have consumed whatever fuel they could find, and then moved on to the next building, the next neighborhood, the next section of what used to be a functioning city. The Willamette River, which normally reflects the city lights in a ribbon of silver, is now dark and littered with debris. I can see what appears to be the twisted remains of at least 2 of the bridges that used to connect the east and west sides of the city. The Morrison Bridge looks like it's partially collapsed, probably from the blast effects, or possibly from structural failure after its electronic control systems were destroyed. This means that even if people wanted to evacuate or move between different parts of the city, many of the major transportation routes are now impassable. But what's most disturbing is the complete absence of normal human activity. There are no cars moving on the streets, no emergency vehicles responding to the fires, no signs of organized rescue or recovery efforts. Just scattered groups of people moving through the ruins, some carrying bags or pushing shopping carts loaded with salvaged goods, others simply wandering aimlessly through the destruction. From this distance, they look like ants scattered from a destroyed nest, moving without purpose or coordination. 20 minutes ago, I was contacted by Rebecca Martinez, a social worker who lives in the Selwood neighborhood on the east side of the river. Rebecca has been working since the attacks to organize her neighbors and establish some kind of mutual aid network, but her description of conditions in the residential areas is deeply troubling. According to Rebecca, the social fabric of the community began unraveling within hours of the electromagnetic pulse. Rebecca said that her neighborhood, which had been a close-knit community where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other, descended into chaos as soon as it became clear that there would be no police response, no emergency services, and no government coordination. People who had been friendly neighbors for years were suddenly competing for the same limited resources, breaking into each other's homes looking for food, medicine, or anything else that might help them survive. The situation was made worse by the fact that many people simply had no idea how to survive without the modern conveniences they'd always depended on. Rebecca described watching neighbors trying unsuccessfully to start fires without matches or lighters, attempting to purify water using methods they'd read about but never practiced, and making potentially dangerous mistakes in basic survival skills because they'd never needed to learn them before. Rebecca also shared some disturbing information about the psychological impact of the disaster on people in her area. She said that many of her neighbors seemed to be in a state of shock or denial, unable to process the magnitude of what had happened. Some were still waiting for the power to come back on, for their phones to start working again, for some kind of government rescue operation to arrive and restore normal life. Others had moved into what she described as a survival panic mode, hoarding whatever resources they could find, and becoming increasingly paranoid about threats from other survivors. Most concerning was Rebecca's description of how quickly normal social inhibitions and moral constraints seemed to disappear. She witnessed several incidents of violence over resources that would have been easily available just 2 days ago. People fighting over canned food, batteries, even basic tools and supplies. She said it was as if the collapse of the technological infrastructure had also caused a collapse of the social infrastructure that normally keeps human behavior within civilized bounds. Rebecca is trying to establish what she calls a neighborhood survival council, bringing together people with useful skills and knowledge to coordinate resource sharing and mutual protection. But she's finding it difficult to get people to trust each other or work together when everyone is focused on their own immediate survival needs. The community cooperation that would be essential for long-term survival seems to be breaking down just when it's needed most. At 4:45 a.m., I received a communication that provided some crucial technical information about our power situation. Tom Bradley, an electrical engineer who worked for Portland General Electric before the attacks, has been conducting systematic assessments of the electrical infrastructure damage. His findings help explain why the power grid failure is so complete and why restoration will be so difficult. According to Tom, the electromagnetic pulse didn't just damage individual electronic devices. It destroyed the complex network of transformers, switching systems, and control computers that manage the flow of electricity from power plants to end users. Even if the generating facilities themselves could be repaired, the distribution system that carries power to homes and businesses would need to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. Tom explained that modern electrical grids are incredibly complex systems that require constant electronic monitoring and adjustment to maintain stable power flow. Without the computerized control systems, even manually operated power plants couldn't safely distribute electricity to the wider grid. The electromagnetic pulse essentially severed all the electronic connections that hold the power system together, leaving us with isolated generating facilities that can't communicate with each other or coordinate their output. The replacement parts needed to rebuild the system would normally be manufactured in specialized facilities that require stable electrical power to operate. This creates what Tom called a catch-22 situation. We need electrical power to manufacture the components required to restore electrical power. Without access to undamaged manufacturing facilities in other regions, or the transportation systems needed to bring replacement components from outside the affected area, the power grid might remain down indefinitely. Tom also provided some sobering estimates about timeline for recovery. He said that even under optimal conditions, with unlimited resources and workforce, rebuilding the electrical infrastructure for a major metropolitan area would take several years. Given our current situation, with no functioning government, limited transportation, compromised supply chains, and a rapidly deteriorating social order, he couldn't estimate when or even if the power grid might be restored. But Tom also identified some potential sources of limited electrical power that might be available for critical applications. Older diesel generators without electronic ignition or control systems might still be functional. Some industrial facilities have mechanical power generation equipment that wasn't affected by the electromagnetic pulse. Solar panel installations with simple, non-electronic charge controllers could potentially provide limited power for basic applications. The key would be identifying these surviving power sources, securing them against looting or destruction, and organizing communities around access to limited electrical capacity for essential functions like medical care, food preservation, and communication. Tom volunteered to share technical information about identifying and operating this equipment with any survivors who have the skills and resources to make use of it. Around 5:15 a.m., I was contacted by someone who provided a different perspective on our situation. Father Miguel Santos reached me from St. Mary's Cathedral, about 6 blocks from the radio station. Father Santos has been serving as an informal coordinator for refugees and displaced people who have been gathering at the cathedral since the attacks, and his insights into human behavior during extreme crisis are both troubling and encouraging. According to Father Santos, over 200 people have sought shelter at the cathedral since last night. They represent a cross-section of the community: families with children, elderly people, individuals with disabilities, people who were injured during the chaos following the electromagnetic pulse. What he's observing is both the worst and best of human nature emerging under extreme stress. Father Santos described incidents of selfishness and cruelty, people refusing to share resources even when others were in desperate need, individuals abandoning family members who were slowing them down or consuming resources. But he also witnessed extraordinary acts of compassion and self-sacrifice, people sharing their last food with strangers, medical professionals providing care without any hope of compensation, individuals putting themselves at risk to help others who were injured or vulnerable. What struck me most about Father Santos's observations was his description of how people are forming new social groups and hierarchies based on survival skills rather than their previous social status. The wealthy businessman who used to command respect in the community might be completely helpless in the current situation, while the unemployed veteran with wilderness survival training becomes a crucial leader. Professional credentials, social connections, and economic status suddenly mean nothing when the primary challenges are finding clean water, starting fires, and protecting against radiation exposure. Father Santos is trying to maintain some sense of community and mutual support among the refugees at the cathedral, organizing work details, resource sharing, and collective decision-making. But he's also realistic about the limitations of what they can accomplish. The cathedral has some food supplies and basic medical equipment, but not nearly enough to sustain 200 people for more than a few days. They have no reliable source of clean water, limited heating capacity, and no way to protect against radiation exposure if contamination levels increase. Most significantly, Father Santos expressed concern about what he called the sustainability of human decency under prolonged extreme stress. He said that people can maintain compassion and cooperation for a short period during a crisis, but as resources become scarcer and the situation becomes more desperate, even good people might be forced to make horrible choices between helping others and ensuring their own survival. As the sun climbs higher and reveals more of the devastation across the city, I'm beginning to understand that we're facing challenges that go far beyond the immediate physical destruction. The electromagnetic pulse and nuclear attacks have destroyed more than just our technological infrastructure. They've disrupted the complex web of social, economic, and governmental systems that hold modern civilization together. The immediate priorities for survival are becoming clear: securing clean water sources that aren't contaminated by radiation, finding or producing food without the supply chains and preservation systems we normally depend on, creating shelter and heating systems that don't require electrical power, establishing basic medical care capabilities using manual equipment and limited supplies, organizing community cooperation and mutual protection without normal law enforcement, developing communication and coordination systems that can function without electronic infrastructure. But the long-term challenges may be even more daunting. Even if we can survive the immediate crisis, we're facing the prospect of rebuilding some form of civilization from the ruins of our technological society. This means relearning skills and knowledge that most people have never needed before: food production and preservation, basic manufacturing and construction techniques, medical care without modern equipment, governance, and conflict resolution without established institutions. The psychological and social challenges may be the most difficult of all. People who have lived their entire lives in a comfortable, technologically sophisticated society are suddenly forced to adapt to conditions that previous generations would have recognized as primitive. The stress, fear, and uncertainty of this transition are already causing breakdowns in social cooperation and moral behavior that could make survival even more difficult. But as I've been broadcasting through this long night and into the dawn, I've also heard evidence of human resilience, adaptability, and compassion that gives me hope. People are already beginning to organize, to share resources, to care for the vulnerable, and to work together for mutual survival. The same qualities that allowed our species to survive previous catastrophes are still present, even in our modern, technologically dependent society. The sun is now fully above the horizon, casting harsh light on the ruins of what used to be Portland, Oregon. The magnitude of the destruction is overwhelming, but it's no longer hidden in darkness. We can see what we're dealing with, assess the challenges we face, and begin the work of survival and recovery. The night of uncertainty is over. The long day of rebuilding begins now. This is Levi Brooks on 97.4 FM. I will continue broadcasting as long as possible, sharing information, coordinating between survivor groups, and maintaining the human connections that will be essential for our collective survival. The world has changed forever, but we are still here, still human, still capable of hope and determination in the face of overwhelming adversity. We will find a way forward, one day at a time.